The signs of his coming, or the things of his coming. Many preach that ours is the generation of Matthew chapter 24, because of many signs that we see written in this chapter. We see them today and have been seeing them for some time. How many times you've seen and heard pastors or anyone say, "These are the signs of the end times or end days," referring to what we read in Matthew chapter 24 from verse 4 to 8. Deceivers and false Christs, wars and rumors of wars, nations and kingdoms rising against each other, pestilences, famines and earthquakes, things that we are seeing today and have been seeing for some time, but today increasing more than ever, preached as the signs of the Lord's coming and of the end of the world. Many pastors preach that Matthew chapter 24 is a chapter of signs of the end times, and we see things and disasters happening around us and across the globe, things that are preached as the signs of the end times in referring to what we read in Matthew chapter 24 from verse 4 to 8. This is a false preaching. First of all, Matthew chapter 24 is not a chapter of signs of the end times, but things that will come into fulfillment in a generation time, that will not pass till all these things be fulfilled, as we see written in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. Verse 34, KJV. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. What many understand as signs in Matthew chapter 24 from verse 4 to 29 are instead written and referred to as things in Matthew chapter 24. Is Matthew chapter 24 a generation of signs that must come into fulfillment so to have the second coming of Jesus Christ and of the end of the world? No, it is a generation of things that must come into fulfillment so to have the second coming of Jesus Christ. Some of you would say, what would be the difference between saying signs and things, even though we see written things between verse 4 and 8, and not signs? There is a big difference, and Jesus knew that difference. Reason for why, in speaking of the things we see written in Matthew chapter 24, he referred to them as things and not signs. In Matthew chapter 24, there is only one sign of the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and that same sign is the sign of the end of the world, from the questions made to Jesus by his disciples. And from the questions made to Jesus on what would be the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, there is only one sign and not many, or a list of them in a generation time. What were the questions of the disciples to Jesus? Matthew chapter 24, KJV, verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him, for to show him the buildings of the temple. Verse 2. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Verse 3. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? In verse 1, Jesus' disciples showed Jesus the temple buildings. In verse 2, Jesus, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Jesus refers to the temple buildings as things. But in verse 3, three questions were made to Jesus from his disciples. Question 1, tell us, when shall these things be? What things? The temple buildings as things that would be thrown down. Jesus prophesied the temple destruction that came in 70 AD in verse 2. But when it comes to the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, this is of a future generation. Question 2, and what shall be the sign of thy coming? Notice, we do not read the signs, plural, of thy coming, but the sign, singular, of thy coming, referring to one sign of thy coming and not many signs. Question 3, and of the end of the world. Were the disciples asking for a sign of his coming and then another sign of the end of the world? No. Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Not a sign of thy coming and then another sign of the end of the world, but that same sign that would signal his coming, and at the same time that same sign that will signal the end of the world. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, we read of one sign only. Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. The sign of thy coming is only one sign, and that is in verse 30, and that same sign is the sign of the end of the world, because we do not read of any other sign in Matthew chapter 24 and in verse 30. It's the same sign, both for thy coming and of the end of the world. The disciples asked Jesus what the sign of thy coming is, and Jesus here in verse 30 speaks of a sign of his coming, but does not reveal what it is. Other than in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, in verse 24, Jesus uses this word sign, but in the plural, signs. But in verse 24, he is not referring to the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, but of signs and wonders of the false Christs and false prophets. Matthew chapter 24, KJV, verse 24, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. When speaking of the sign of his coming, we see sign written only in verse 30, and referring to what are the signs of his coming, we read of only one sign and not two or more signs or a list of signs. Sign referring to the sign of his coming, we see it written only in verse 30. The sign precedes the coming of Jesus Christ, but Jesus does not reveal what is this sign, and there is a reason for why he does not reveal what it is. We do not read sign beginning from verse 4. We do not see written sign or signs beginning from verse 4, and there is a reason why we see it written in verse 30 and not beginning from verse 4. Jesus does not speak of signs in the plural sense, but of one sign of his coming and of the end of the world. Jesus' disciples asked for one sign of his coming and of the end of the world, and not many signs or a list of signs. When it comes to everything else, we read in Matthew chapter 24, to be fulfilled in a generation time, in Jesus' words, these are things to be fulfilled and not signs. What would be the difference between signs of his coming as preached, and instead of saying things of his coming as written. Other than the meaning from any dictionary, which would have sign and thing of very different meanings from each other, the difference between saying signs of his coming and things of his coming in Matthew chapter 24 is of the following reason, in why we read things as written and not signs as preached. Jesus' disciples asked for one sign of his coming and of the end of the world, not signs in the plural. Jesus' disciples asked for one sign of his coming and of the end of the world, not a list of signs, as many preachers preach, as the signs of his coming. Jesus answers the question of his disciples by speaking of a sign, but not revealing what it is. And this sign comes in verse 30 and is seen immediately before his coming, which could be anywhere between hours or even days from when that sign appears in heaven. And what I mean by hours and days, I am referring to hours and days in the literal sense, as I said before in my previous video. Matthew chapter 24 is a chapter of things that must be fulfilled in a generation time, as we read in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Notice we read things and not signs. We have not had such a church generation where all things in Matthew chapter 24 fulfill themselves in a generation time. Why do we read sign in Matthew chapter 24 verse 30 and not beginning from verse 4? Because if we were to read sign or signs beginning from verse 4, then everything we would then read in Matthew chapter 24 from verse 4 to 29 would no longer be a thing, but a sign or signs of his coming. Why do we read? What do we read between verse 4 and 8? Matthew chapter 24 KJV verse 4. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. Verse 5. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Verse 6. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Verse 7. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. Verse 8. All these are the beginning of sorrows. If we were to see written, beginning from verse 4, sign or signs, and everywhere else in Matthew chapter 24, where we see written thing or things, including verse 34, things, if we were to see the word things replaced by sign or signs, then we would have the whole of Matthew chapter 24 from verse 4 to 31, a failed and confusing chapter, impossible to understand. Why? Because almost everything we see written in Matthew chapter 24, excluding verse 24, has already happened in the course of 2,000 years of church history. Not everything of Matthew chapter 24 in a single generation, but there are things of Matthew chapter 24 that church history has seen in previous generations, and then there are things never seen in any church generation. If everything we see written in Matthew chapter 24 were to be a sign of his coming, or see written sign, then this would have the second coming of Jesus Christ in any generation, or all church generations, as that Matthew chapter 24 generation. Wars and rumors of wars alone, preached as being signs of thy coming and of the end of the world, would have every church generation of wars, as that generation we see written in Matthew chapter 24, and with no coming of Jesus in any of these generations, would have Matthew chapter 24 a not trustful source of Bible end-time prophecy. A pestilence alone, or an earthquake alone, preached as a sign of thy coming. And that generation, even though not fulfilling everything of that chapter, preached also as signs, would have that generation of Matthew chapter 24, even if most of the chapter is missing from that generation. But what is that sign in verse 30? Jesus does not reveal what that sign we read in Matthew chapter 24 verse 30 is. Why didn't Jesus reveal what that sign is that we read in verse 30? The reason is simple. So not to have any celestial event confused as the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, anything from a solar eclipse to a passing comet or a meteorite falling onto the earth or exploding in the atmosphere, or even an aurora borealis or even a UFO, confused as the sign of his coming and of the end of the world. Jesus does not reveal what this sign is in Matthew chapter 24, but he does reveal something of what it is, but mostly what it will cause, in seeing it, by which everyone will see it. In fact, it's also through that sign that Jesus distracts the world watching it while he raptures his church, having it caught up in the clouds up into heaven. What is the sign in Matthew chapter 24 verse 30 of the coming of Jesus Christ and of the end of the world? It appears that no one till today has discovered what it is, and even if someone has discovered what it is, his discovery is only half of the story of that sign. In about a week or 10 days, you will know what it is. Prepare yourselves, because what you will hear from me in the next week, and in the next video is very disturbing. Thank you.